May 16th, 1943. Wing Commander Guy Gibson stood in the briefing room at RAF Scampton and stared at the scale model on the table. It showed three massive dams in Germany's Ruhr Valley: the Möhne, the Eder, and the Sorpe. Each one was a concrete fortress, holding back millions of tons of water that powered the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. His commanding officer had just finished explaining the mission. 19 Lancaster bombers would fly 400 miles into enemy territory at treetop level in darkness to destroy these dams using a weapon that didn't exist 6 months ago. The room was silent. Every pilot understood what the briefing officer hadn't said out loud. This was essentially a suicide mission. The dams were protected by flak towers, anti-aircraft batteries, barrage balloons, and torpedo nets that made conventional bombing impossible. British High Command had been trying to figure out how to destroy them since 1937. Every analysis had reached the same conclusion. It couldn't be done. But Gibson and his hand-picked crews were about to prove that analysis catastrophically wrong, and the weapon they were carrying, a 4-ton cylinder that bounced across water like a skipping stone, would demonstrate that the most impossible targets could fall to the right combination of innovation, courage, and precision that bordered on insanity.
The Ruhr Valley dams weren't just infrastructure. They were the lifeblood of Germany's war machine. The Möhne Dam alone held back 140 million cubic meters of water that supplied hydroelectric power to factories producing tanks, artillery, ammunition, and aircraft. The Sorpe Dam regulated water flow for the entire industrial region. The Eder Dam controlled flooding and maintained water levels for the Mittelland Canal, crucial for transporting war materials across Germany. British intelligence had identified these dams as strategic targets as early as 1937, but attacking them presented problems that seemed insurmountable. The dams were massive structures, some over 130 feet thick at the base, built from reinforced concrete that could absorb conventional bombs without significant damage. Torpedo nets protected the water approaches. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed every dam. And the reservoirs themselves were in valleys surrounded by hills that made level bombing runs nearly impossible. Conventional high-altitude bombing was useless. The bombs either missed entirely or bounced off the dam faces without penetrating. Low-level torpedo attacks couldn't work because of the protective netting. Every tactical analysis reached the same depressing conclusion. The dams were effectively invulnerable to air attack. Then, a 55-year-old engineer named Barnes Wallis proposed an idea that sounded like something from a Jules Verne novel. What if a bomb could skip across the water's surface, strike the dam face below the waterline, sink while remaining in contact with the wall, and detonate at a precise depth where the explosion would shatter the concrete through hydrostatic pressure? The concept was brilliant in theory. In practice, it required solving problems that had never been attempted. The bomb had to be cylindrical and spinning backward at 500 revolutions per minute when released to create the skipping effect. It had to be dropped from exactly 60 feet altitude at exactly 232 miles per hour, and it had to skip in a perfectly controlled trajectory to strike the dam at the precise angle and depth. Oh, and the pilots would have to do all of this at night, under enemy fire, while flying so low that one mistake meant crashing into the reservoir. Air Ministry officials listened to Wallis's presentation and politely told him he was insane. But Wallis had a track record. He had designed the Wellington bomber and several revolutionary aircraft. He wasn't a crackpot proposing a fantasy weapon. He was a serious engineer with calculations, models, and test data. Eventually, he got permission to build a prototype. The development process was a race against time. Wallis conducted test drops at Reculver on the Kent coast, fine-tuning the weapon's design through trial and error. The bomb's weight, rotation speed, release altitude, and aircraft velocity all had to be perfectly balanced. Too heavy, and it sank immediately. Too light, and it skipped over the dam. Too fast a rotation, and it bounced away. Too slow, and it didn't skip at all. By early 1943, Wallis had a working design. The weapon weighed 9,250 pounds and measured 60 inches in diameter. It would be spun backward by a hydraulic motor at 500 revolutions per minute before release. When dropped from exactly 60 feet at exactly 232 miles per hour, it would skip across the water 3 or 4 times before striking the dam face and sinking while still rotating and in contact with the wall. A hydrostatic fuse would detonate it at a depth of 30 feet, creating a pressure wave that would shatter even reinforced concrete. The weapon worked in testing. Now the Air Ministry needed pilots crazy enough to use it in combat. Wing Commander Guy Gibson was 24 years old and already a legend in RAF Bomber Command. He had completed over 170 combat missions, survived multiple tours, and earned a reputation as a pilot who could fly anything, anywhere, under any conditions. In March 1943, he was pulled from rotation and given a classified assignment: form a new squadron, handpick the best bomber crews in the RAF, train them for a special mission, and prepare to do something that had never been attempted in the history of aerial warfare. Gibson began recruiting. He didn't tell the crews what they'd be attacking. He simply asked for volunteers willing to fly dangerous, low-level night missions that would require precision flying beyond anything they'd attempted before. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, he had assembled 147 aircrew, 19 Lancaster bombers, and created Squadron 617, which would become the most famous bombing unit in RAF history. Training began at Scampton in late March. The crews practiced low-level flying over English reservoirs, learning to maintain exactly 60 feet altitude by using spotlights mounted on the Lancaster's belly that created figure-8 patterns on the water when the aircraft was at the correct height. They rehearsed navigation at treetop level in darkness, flying routes that simulated the terrain they'd face over Germany. And they practiced timing runs where bombardiers had to release weapons at exact moments while the pilot maintained precise speed and altitude. The crews knew they were training for something extraordinary, but Gibson didn't reveal the actual target until May 15th, the day before the mission. When he finally showed them the models of the dams and explained the weapon, reactions ranged from awe to disbelief. Some pilots thought it was brilliant. Others thought it was suicide. All of them volunteered to fly. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the Dam Busters raid. Drop a comment below and let me know if you've heard about this attack. May 16th, 1943, 9:28 p.m. 19 Lancasters rolled down the runway at Scampton and climbed into the gathering darkness. They were organized into 3 waves. Gibson would lead the first wave of 9 aircraft, attacking the Möhne Dam. If successful, survivors would proceed to the Eder. The second wave of 5 aircraft would attack the Sorpe Dam using a different technique suited to that dam's unique construction. The third wave of 5 aircraft would serve as a mobile reserve, attacking secondary targets or reinforcing the main attacks as needed. The route took them across the North Sea at wave-top height to avoid German radar, then across Holland and into Germany, following valleys and rivers to stay below enemy detection. Gibson's aircraft, AJG for George, led the formation at exactly 100 feet, low enough that rear gunners could see white caps on the water below them. German flak positions along the Dutch coast opened fire as the formation thundered overhead. Lancaster AJB, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Bill Astel, struck a high-tension power line and exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the night sky. The mission was 30 minutes old, and 617 Squadron had already lost its first crew. The remaining aircraft pressed on. They flew so low that pilots had to pull up to avoid church steeples. Rear gunners reported cows scattering in the fields below. The Lancasters screamed across the German countryside at 240 miles per hour, their Merlin engines creating a thunder that woke entire villages. At 12:28 a.m. on May 17th, Gibson's formation reached the Möhne Dam. The target sat in a valley surrounded by hills, exactly as the models had shown. Moonlight reflected off the massive reservoir, and every flak tower around the dam opened fire simultaneously, the sky filled with tracers. Gibson positioned AJG for the attack run. His flight engineer called out altitude. His bombardier, Spam Spafford, crouched over the simple bomb site Wallis had designed. Two spotlights on the Lancaster's belly projected onto the water, and when they formed a figure 8, the aircraft was at exactly 60 feet. Gibson throttled up to exactly 232 miles per hour and flew straight at the dam through a curtain of anti-aircraft fire. Spafford released the weapon. The 4-ton cylinder tumbled from the bomb bay, already spinning backward at 500 revolutions per minute. It struck the water and skipped. Once, twice, 3 times. Then it hit the dam face 20 feet from the center, sank, and detonated. A massive column of water erupted 1,000 feet into the air. The explosion shook the valley. But when the water settled, the dam was still standing. Gibson circled and watched as Flight Lieutenant Hopgood made his run in AJM. Flak struck the Lancaster as it approached, setting the port wing on fire. Hopgood held steady and released his weapon, but the aircraft was too high. The bomb skipped over the dam and exploded on the power station below. A JM climbed, trailing flames, then broke apart. 3 crew members escaped. 4 died in the crash. Flight Lieutenant Martin attacked next in AJP. His weapon struck the dam perfectly and detonated. Another massive explosion, another tower of water. The dam shook but held. Then Squadron Leader Young attacked in AJA. His bomb struck true. The explosion merged with the previous craters. Cracks appeared in the concrete face. Gibson could see them in the moonlight. Flight Lieutenant Maltby made the 5th run in AJJ. His bombardier released at the perfect moment. The weapon skipped across the reservoir, struck the dam face, sank, and detonated at exactly 30 feet depth. The explosion was different this time. The water column was larger, the sound was deeper, and when the spray cleared, a section of the Möhne Dam 100 feet wide and 100 feet deep was gone. Water poured through the breach in a roaring torrent. Within minutes, the gap widened as water pressure tore away additional concrete. The reservoir, which had taken years to fill, was emptying at a rate of thousands of cubic meters per second. A 30-foot wall of water was roaring down the Ruhr Valley, heading straight for the industrial heartland of Nazi Germany. Gibson radioed the code word slur to Scampton headquarters. The Möhne Dam was breached. He ordered the surviving aircraft to follow him to the Eder Dam 50 miles southeast. The Eder was undefended by flak, but the approach was even more difficult. The dam sat in a steep valley requiring pilots to dive over a forested hillside, level out precisely at 60 feet while accelerating to exactly 232 miles per hour, release the weapon, then pull up sharply to avoid crashing into the hills on the far side. In darkness. Flight Lieutenant Shannon made 3 attempts and couldn't line up the approach correctly. The valley was too narrow, the timing too precise. He pulled away and let Flight Lieutenant Maudslay try. Maudslay's bomb struck the dam but exploded late. The blast damaged his aircraft. He radioed that he was heading home but never made it. His Lancaster crashed in Germany, killing all aboard. Shannon tried again. On his 5th attempt, he released perfectly. The weapon skipped, struck, sank, and detonated. The Eder Dam cracked but held. Flight Lieutenant Knight attacked in AJN. His weapon struck the same point Shannon had hit. The combined explosions shattered the concrete. The Eder Dam failed catastrophically. Another massive breach opened, releasing 160 million cubic meters of water into the valley below. 2 dams destroyed. The mission was succeeding beyond anyone's hopes, but the cost was mounting. Of the 19 Lancasters that had taken off from Scampton, 8 had been shot down or crashed. 53 aircrew were dead or missing. the survivors turned for home, flying the same low-level route through darkness and flak. They landed at Scampton between 3 and 6 a.m. on May 17th. 11 Lancasters returned. 8 did not. The damage in Germany was catastrophic. The Möhne breach released a flood that swept through the Ruhr Valley, destroying factories, bridges, roads, and railways. Power stations were submerged. Coal mines flooded. At least 1,600 people drowned, many of them forced laborers from occupied territories housed in camps in the valley. The Eder flood devastated agricultural areas and disrupted transportation networks across central Germany. German authorities needed weeks to restore basic services and months to repair the dams. Industrial production in the Ruhr dropped significantly. Hydroelectric power was reduced by 75%. Water supplies for factories were disrupted for months. The psychological impact was equally significant. The dams had been considered invulnerable. Their destruction proved that no target in Germany was safe from British ingenuity and determination. Gibson was awarded the Victoria Cross. Other crew members received Distinguished Service Orders and Distinguished Flying Crosses. Squadron 617 became legendary, but the price had been appalling. Of the 133 aircrew who flew the mission, 53 died and 3 were captured. A 40% casualty rate for a single operation was devastating, even by Bomber Command's brutal standards. The Dam Busters raid demonstrated several crucial lessons that echoed through the rest of the war. First, that innovation could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The bouncing bomb was a weapon that shouldn't have worked. It required perfect conditions, suicidal courage, and precision that seemed impossible. But it worked because brilliant engineers and skilled pilots refused to accept that some targets were invulnerable. Second, that specialized training and hand-picked crews could accomplish what conventional forces could not. Gibson's decision to recruit the best pilots, bombardiers, and navigators in Bomber Command created a unit capable of precision that mass formations couldn't achieve. Third, that some strategic targets were worth catastrophic losses. The dam raid killed 53 British aircrew and 1,600 people in Germany. It disrupted German industry for months and demonstrated British capability to strike any target. Whether that exchange was justified remains debated by historians. But there's no question it was one of the most audacious operations in military aviation history. Today, the Möhne and Eder dams have been rebuilt and still operate. The Sorpe, which was never successfully breached during the war, still holds back its reservoir. Memorials at each site commemorate both the British aircrew, who died attacking them, and the German civilians who drowned in the floods. The story of 617 Squadron became legend, immortalized in books, films, and military academies worldwide. The bouncing bomb itself was never used operationally again, though the principle influenced weapon development for decades. Barnes Wallis continued designing aircraft and weapons until his death in 1979, always maintaining that the dam raid proved the value of unconventional thinking applied to impossible problems. Guy Gibson flew additional missions with 617 Squadron before being killed in September 1944 when his Mosquito crashed on a mission over the Netherlands. He was 26 years old. The Lancaster bomber became a symbol of RAF Bomber Command's war, and 617 Squadron continued flying special missions until the end of the war and beyond, earning a reputation as the unit that would attempt anything. The lesson of the Dam Busters resonates beyond World War II tactics and technology. When experts declare a target invulnerable, when conventional wisdom says a mission is impossible, when the mathematics say it can't be done, sometimes all that's needed is an engineer willing to ignore the impossibility, a commander willing to recruit the best, and 133 men willing to fly into hell because someone asked them to try. Germany's dams were considered indestructible, massive concrete fortresses that had stood for decades, protected by everything German engineering could devise. Until 19 Lancasters carrying a weapon that bounced across water proved that indestructible just means no one's tried the right approach yet. That's how 617 Squadron did the impossible. And that's how a 4-ton cylinder that skipped like a stone changed what military strategists thought could be achieved with courage, innovation, and 19 crews willing to fly a suicide mission because someone believed it might work. The dams fell, the Ruhr flooded, and the impossible became history.